from the story of Karbala and talk about them in a way that we can talk about them also with our non-Muslim neighbours. And this week, or rather today, I want to take a theme which is the most common question that I am asked when I go to speak about Islam. And you can all imagine what that question is. It's a question about Islam and women. How are women treated in Islam? And so I want to talk this evening about the women of Karbala, to take messages from their example that we can share to explode some myths in the understanding of people about women and Islam. Women are very much in the press at the moment. You may have heard that the latest figures were released by the United Nations 2 weeks ago for the number of refugees in the world. The number of refugees in the world today has reached 50 million people. 50 million. This is the largest number of refugees in the world since 1945. This is an enormous tragedy when you consider. And we know the places from which these refugees are coming. From Syria, from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from the Sudan. Something over 80% of all the refugees in the world are Muslim. And of course, the vast majority of those refugees are women and children. So we need to be aware and to talk about this theme. Another horrifying thought. If you go back 100 years, then warfare was conducted between men in uniform, soldier against soldier. So something around 93% of all the people who were killed in war were men in uniform. That changes completely during the 20th century. So by the end of the 20th century, we have bombing of cities, we have missiles, we have long-range weapons, we have weapons of mass destruction. And so that about 95, 97% of all the victims of warfare in our own day actually are civilians. They're not men in uniform anymore. Overwhelmingly again, women and children. So we need always to be thinking, how do we talk about this and what lessons can we learn from the tragedy of Karbala? So let us begin. Let us go back, first of all, to Medina and to see Imam Hussein and his companions and his family moving from Medina to Mecca and then leaving Mecca actually on the second day of Hajj with such urgency. And let us ask ourselves the question, why didn't Imam Hussein leave his family behind? Why not leave them behind? Why take them into the desert? Because of his responsibility, of course, to make sure that they were looked after and protected. How looked after and protected in the desert, for goodness sake? When you're shadowed by soldiers. When you go, you do not know where. Looked after and protected by the one who looks after and protects best. He prefers to trust in God to look after and to protect, rather than trusting in the agents of Yazid. And so he takes them with him in his journey into the desert. So let's just imagine then, the women of the company are traveling through the desert, experiencing all the hardships of thirst and of sand and of heat and so on. But of course they are women, so they are experiencing more hardship than any one of us men could possibly imagine. because they are carrying with them the children, the small ones, the children who are growing, and so their concern is always what's going to happen to the children. It's not a concern for themselves, it is a concern for the young ones who are entrusted into their care. And so the first lesson then that we can take from the women of Karbala is to say they go with complete trust in God. And we have to ask, what kind of a being is God? God is pure goodness. There is no evil in God. And therefore, if you submit and trust all to God, the outcome must be good. Because God wills no evil. Therefore, we can take the first lesson, that of absolute trust. But then we can go on. Because we know that as the story develops, they come into a time of increasing acute thirst and hardship. And we can move all the way forward to the field of Karbala itself. What is it to be thirsty? It's not good. It hurts. What is it to be a mother and to listen to your child crying with thirst, and you can do nothing about it? You can do nothing to relieve its suffering. So whoever told you that women are the weaker sex has no thought. How can it be for a mother to sit and listen to her child crying with thirst and can do nothing to relieve its suffering? And so the inner strength of the women, this is the second message that we must take from the women of Karbala. The time goes on. The time of battle draws closer. It is the women's responsibility to prepare their menfolk for battle. They know the odds. They know the numbers who are assembled against them. Now, it's one thing to go out armed and with weapons to face the enemy. But it's another thing entirely to prepare your brother, your husband, your sons to go out to face the enemy. How does that challenge, how does that threaten the natural compassion of a mother, of a sister, of a wife? And yet we know again and again in the story of Karbala the way in which the womenfolk prepared the men to go into the field of battle. To go into the field of battle knowing that this is certain death. The odds are impossible. And so that faith and trust in God is challenged even more, because they are now facing two of the most ultimate questions that we can ever face as human beings. One question is there anything more important than your life? Is there anything that's actually worth dying for? Well, many people in society will tell us preserving life is the most important thing. Well, Karbala puts the other question. Is there anything actually more important than your life? Is there anything worth dying for? And preparing your menfolk, strengthening them, there is something worth dying for. Better to die with dignity for the sake of justice than to live with indignity and disgrace. And then they face the second question, a question that many of us speak about very glibly. After this life there comes the life hereafter. Well, that's easy to say when you're sitting comfortably with a full stomach in a nice quiet room in the middle of Dublin. But when you are preparing your menfolk to go and face death, then comes the real challenge of faith. There is the life hereafter. I promise you, my son. And so they strengthen the faith, they strengthen the courage of the menfolk who are about to go into battle. And so women are the bearers of the inner strength. Not only the bearers of the bodies of men in their wombs as babies, as they grow and develop, but also the bearers of that courage and that strength. It's helpful often that we should take an example from the biblical tradition. So let's take a small example. About 150 years before the time of Jesus, the Jewish community were being persecuted. The Romans had come and they were oppressing them, and they were using the Holy Temple as a place of idol worship. And this was so outrageous to one particular family that they rose up as a family in order to withstand this oppression. And they were captured, and there was a family of 7 brothers. And they brought forward the instruments of torture, and they took the first brother and they started to torture him. And then they went to his mother. "Oh, mother," they said, "speak to your son. Tell him, give up. Tell him to worship the idols, and then we'll let him go." The mother approached her son. "My son," she said, "I am your mother. I am the one who gave you life, who brought you into this world. Do not disgrace the womb that bore you. Be firm, be strong in faith." And so the son was firm and endured until death. And then the second brother was born, and the third and the fourth, until you went all the way through to the 7th. And in each time, the mother comes forward to strengthen the faith and the commitment and determination of her son. What kind of strength is that? What man could actually do that? This is the strength of the faith, then, which sustains the women on the field of Karbala. We know the way in which the women had to receive back the bodies of the dead, the bodies that were torn and mutilated and had been hacked in various ways. We know the strength that they showed. We know as well the awesome events after the death of Imam Hussein, the ransacking of the tents, the uncertainty as to what is going to happen next. And yet they persevere. And then we know that they are taken in chains and in humiliation to Damascus. And then finally we remember that example. You remember the famous hadith of the Prophet himself, who says, the greatest jihad is to speak the word of truth into the face of a tyrant. And who sets that example? Who set that example? It is Lady Zainab herself, you remember, who stands and speaks in the face of the tyrant, and who declares the truth into the face of the tyrant with a courage which is beyond most of our imagination. Now then, whoever said that women are the weaker sex, let's tell them the story of the women of Karbala. Let's tell them the way in which women are the bearers of the inner strength. Let me just finish by one contemporary Irish example. Oh. You see the generosity. Let us take then two contemporary examples. You will perhaps remember in the writings of George Bernard Shaw, that great figure of English-Irish literature. George Bernard Shaw has the saying, "Evil indeed is the man who is not mourned by at least one good woman." Evil indeed is the man who is not mourned by at least one good woman. In other words, that generosity of heart, that desire to find some reason to forgive, to show mercy, is part of the very nature of being a woman. The Arabic scholars amongst us will know that Al-Rahman has the same Arabic root, Rahm, as the womb. So if you want to understand the nature of the mercy of God, think of the womb of the woman. Think of that womb which provides nourishment, guidance, sustenance, strength, and support, not because you ask. Can you imagine a fetus growing in the womb of the mother? "Please, mother, supply me with some nourishment." Nonsense. It is of the very nature of the woman then to be merciful, to be compassionate, to be full of that tenderness and mercy. Evil indeed is the man for whom there is no single woman who will find some good, who will find some reason to say, well, things were bad, there was a bad childhood, there was a bad experience, something happened. It is the nature of women to be Al-Rahman. Now my final contemporary example. You remember the name of John McCarthy. You need to be a little older to remember the name of John McCarthy. John McCarthy was an Irish journalist who was taken hostage for a number of years in the Lebanon. Now, during this time, very little was heard of him, but he had a mother. And his mother was growing older, and she became sick. She had cancer. The doctors told her, "You will die from this cancer. This is terminal." She said, "How long have I got?" 3 months, 6 months. And she said to them, "I will not die until I hear that my son is sick." Imagine the strength of this woman. And she lives 13 months beyond all the predictions, the best predictions of the medics. Because they are predicting on the basis of medical science. And she is a woman full of strength and courage, who is determined that she will know some news of her son before she dies. So, next time that you hear people talk nonsense about Islam and women, we can use the story of Karbala to bring out so many aspects of strength, of trust, of courage, of bearing those beautiful names. If you bear the name Ar-Rahman, what better name could you want to bear into the world?